Today, we're going to talk about the word because. Have you ever been told that you can't start a sentence with because? Forget it. The truth of the matter is that you not only can start a sentence with because, but you often should start a sentence with because. However, there are rules to this process. Because is a subordinating conjunction. Now, when you start a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, such as because, or any other subordinating conjunction, you must do two things. First, you must close out that introductory element with a comma. And second, you must complete the sentence with an independent clause. Let us take a look at an example. Because Meow Mix is so good, comma, cats ask for it by name. Meow. Now, here we have the word because at the beginning of the sentence, and that introduces a subordinate clause. Because Meow Mix is so good. And when we're done that clause, that introductory element, we close it out with a comma, and then afterwards we have an independent clause, which is a fancy way of saying a complete sentence. Cats ask for it by name. That functions as a complete sentence. It's therefore an independent clause. And now because you've started with because, you've closed that out with a comma, and you have an independent clause for it, this sentence works properly. When starting a sentence with because, you want to avoid sentence fragments. And this is the common issue. When you open a sentence with a subordinating conjunction, you are creating a subordinate clause. If you do not pair a subordinate clause with an independent clause afterwards, then you have an incomplete sentence, which is also known as a sentence fragment. And this is the common issue that occurs when people use because at the beginning of a sentence. Let's take a look at an example. Perhaps Camila Cabello, ambassador to L'Oreal, asks you, why do you use L'Oreal? And in your reply, you simply say, because you're worth it. Let's explain what's going on here. In casual conversation, you can reply like this because the reader understands the implied context of the subordinate clause. They know that it's tied to and in response to the question that they've asked. However, in academic contexts, this approach is problematic. But why is it problematic in academic context if it's acceptable in casual conversation? Well, the reason is threefold. First, it is grammatically incorrect. We're creating a sentence fragment. Second, it's seen as informal. In casual context, this is acceptable because it's casual conversation. But in formal language, there is an expectation to adhere to grammatical rules. And finally, and most importantly, it can create confusion. Let us examine how a sentence fragment can create confusion in an academic context. You might begin by saying, I use Tide. And then later you add, it gets my clothes clean. And in between, you have a sentence fragment because it is effective. The issue here is the reader doesn't know whether that sentence fragment should be tied to the sentence that comes before or the sentence that comes after. So for instance, it could be read as, I use Tide because it is effective. Or alternately, because it is effective, it gets my clothes clean. And because of this confusion, the reader won't be clear as to which sentence that subordinate clause is meant to be tied to. And this is the reason why we don't want to have sentence fragments in our academic writing, aside from the informality and grammatical concerns. So, why is there so much confusion about whether or not we should or should not use the word because at the beginning of a sentence? Well, the primary reason is teachability. If you're instructing somebody about how to use a subordinated conjunction at the beginning of a sentence, you first have to explain what a subordinate conjunction is. And that requires that they understand what a conjunction is and what all the other parts of speech are. And they have to then differentiate that subordinating conjunction from a coordinating conjunction. Then they have to understand what a subordinate clause is. And that also necessitates understanding the components of a clause, which includes the subject and predicate. They also have to understand how commas work, and they need to understand how an independent clause works and how that differs from a subordinate conjunction. And when you're teaching all of these complex components to a young student in grade 2 or grade 3, it's going to be very difficult for the entire class to really grasp those concepts and process them effectively. But it will be very easy for them to process a simple rule. Don't start a sentence with because. If the students in the class are struggling with the rule, the teacher simply gives them an easy to follow rule that they can apply to their writing without having to think too much about it. And this is the primary reason why this misconception occurs that you can't start a sentence with because. And now that we know that we can use because at the beginning of a sentence, we want to know when it is ideal to use because at the beginning of a sentence. So you have a subordinate clause, and whether at the beginning or end of the sentence, that subordinate clause is seen as secondary to the independent clause. That independent clause is the main component of the sentence and the key takeaway message. However, the placement of that subordinate clause does create a difference. If you place the subordinate clause after the independent clause, it's a secondary thought. In fact, the reader might even skim through it, and they're not going to give as much weight to that clause. However, if you put the subordinate clause before the independent clause, it establishes important context, and it tells the reader that this is essential to understanding the main clause. What's the result? Though still subordinate, you give more weight to the clause when you open the sentence with it. In addition, it also shapes how the reader processes and understands the independent clause that follows. You're providing a very specific context and a lens through which they will understand and read that independent clause that follows. So with that in mind, let's put this principle into practice. Before versus after. I missed class, this is our independent clause, because the bus was late. And that's our subordinate clause, it comes after. Now, alternately, we could put the subordinate clause before, because the bus was late, comma, I missed class. The question here is, how do the readers process these sentences differently based on the sequencing of the clauses? Let's first take a look at when you have the independent clause first, I missed class. When the reader sees that, the brain is lightning quick. It's going to start making judgments and assumptions, and it may immediately assume that the person speaking does not take their classes seriously, that they have poor time management skills. And then when they read the subordinate clause after, it comes across as an excuse. However, if we begin with because the bus was late, in this context, we create tension. We show that there's a problem, and the reader understands that problem first and foremost before they go into the independent clause. And with that information, they'll be able to process and evaluate what happened afterwards. So you can see the resequencing of these can shape the way the reader processes the information. Let's do a quick overview. You can start a sentence with because. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this. However, when you do, you must close that introductory element out with a comma, and that must be followed by an independent clause. Moreover, this approach is especially effective when you feel that the subordinate clause provides important context that can shape understanding. All right, I hope that was clear and informative. If you have any questions at all, drop them in the comments section below and we'll be sure to get to them as soon as possible. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.